Adam Gopnik, Gopnick, writes for the New Yorker magazine. And Adam has a daughter named Olivia. And when Olivia was 3 years old, she had an imaginary friend named Charlie Ravioli. The Gopnicks lived in Manhattan, and according to Olivia, so did Charlie Ravioli. He lived, she said, at the corner of Lexington and Madison, which is interesting because those streets run parallel with each other. But it sounds like a great neighborhood, doesn't it? Now, there was something about Olivia's relationship with Charlie that was a bit disturbing. You see, Olivia never could reach Charlie, never could spend much time with him. Adam would walk into a room and he'd see Olivia holding up her toy telephone to her ear and say, "Hello, Ravioli? Ravioli, are you there? It's Olivia. Can you come over and play? Well, call me." Then she'd put down her phone and shake her head and say, "I always get his answering machine." Adam's sister was a psychologist, and Adam called her up because it just seemed a little strange that a child would invent a friend who was always too busy to play with her. But his psychologist sister said, "That's normal. It's completely normal. Every child in New York City has a busy imaginary friend." But then later, on another day, Adam and his wife overhear Olivia talking on her phone again, this time to a new person named Laurie. It turns out that Laurie is the imaginary assistant to Charlie Ravioli. She was answering his telephone for him and told Olivia that unfortunately Mr. Ravioli was in a meeting and would not be able to play today. Adam's wife said, "This is very wrong. Very wrong. I'm not a child psychologist, but I know that imaginary friends should not have assistants." And so Adam calls psychologist's sister again and says, "Ravioli now has an assistant who's answering his phone. Would you describe this as normal?" She said, "Nope, never heard of that before." It doesn't take a psychologist to figure out what happened. Olivia had captured and copied the tone and pace of her family life. Adam Gopnik's wife reports receiving a telephone call one morning from a friend who was asking her to check her email regarding a phone message she needed to listen to so that she could make a phone call about a fax that they had both received asking for more information about a purchase that they were considering that would require two companies to exchange phone calls, emails, and faxes of drafts of contracts. It is never ending, is it? This web of incompleteness, this tangle of busyness. It seems almost impossible to maintain an authentic life in God when we are so busy. When there is that little voice whispering in our ears, you ought to answer those messages. You ought to go through your emails. You ought to do more. You need to do more, and do it faster, faster, faster. In our scripture reading today, even Jesus appears to get caught up in this. He was really, really busy. Everyone in town wanted to be in touch with him. He had been teaching in the synagogue, and then he and some of the disciples go over to Simon's house, where they discover that Simon's mother-in-law is very sick with a high fever, and Jesus heals her. After having some supper, there is more work to do. At sundown, they bring him everyone who has anything wrong with them. People just keep coming and coming and coming. The text says that the whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many of them. And then the text says, the next morning, while it was still very dark, he went out by himself to a deserted place and prayed. Were there still people needing him? Wanting him? Of course. When the disciples woke up and saw that he was gone, they were upset because there were so many other people looking for Jesus, needing his help. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he went out by himself to a deserted place and prayed. The disciples finally locate him. Don't you know that everyone is looking for you? They need you. Of course he knows they need him. That's why he went off. He had to get out of touch with all that was around him so he could get back in touch with the source of his strength. He had to pull away in order to continue to help people later. Like Charlie Ravioli, we have places to go and things to do and emails to answer. But we cannot be filled with new life, and we cannot have life and hope to share with others if we are out of touch with the source of light and hope. Jesus understood human life, and the great secret of his strength had to do with his always remembering that his strength did not come from himself, but from God, the creator and source of life. As Christians, we believe that there is more than the physical world we live in. We believe that there is another level of reality. None of us knows what that reality is exactly like. All of us have our different ideas and opinions of it. But there is a second world of non-material reality, charged with energy and power. And although we cannot see it, it is more real than this world. For the physical world, the material is finite, not permanent, just as our bodies are not permanent. But the spirit world is permanent, eternal. In fact, the opening verse of the book of Genesis portrays the visible world as having its origin in spirit, in God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And this other world, this spirit world, is not literally somewhere else. It's not the heaven above us. Though God can be spoken of as being up in heaven, our biblical tradition makes it clear that God and the world of spirit are not literally somewhere else. Rather, God is everywhere. Talking about and to God, the writer of Psalm 139 says, "If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, in the grave, you are there. If I dwell by the farthest oceans, even there your hand will guide me. I can never escape from your spirit. I can never get away from your presence." The psalmist knows that God and the world of spirit are all around us, including within us. The Apostle Paul wrote, "In God we live and move and have our being." Think about that. The divine is in you and is all around us. Rather than God being somewhere else, we are in God. We live in spirit, even though we are typically unaware of this reality. Just as Charlie Ravioli is unaware of how hard Olivia is trying to be with him, unaware of how many times she's trying to connect with him, unaware of how much she cares for him and wants to be with him. As we are about to move into the season of Lent, I encourage you to take the reality of the world of spirit seriously. And part of that means practicing prayer, practicing the presence of God. In his last book before he died, Marcus Borg writes the following about prayer. Among the reasons that we in the modern world have difficulty giving credence to the reality of spirit is the disappearance of the deeper forms of prayer from our experience. Most of us are aware primarily of a form of prayer in which God is addressed with words, whether out loud in the context of private prayer or internally in private prayer. Such verbal prayer is typically relatively brief, ordinarily no longer than a few minutes, perhaps sometimes longer in private devotion. But verbal prayer is only one form of prayer in the Jewish Christian tradition. Indeed, it is only the first stage of prayer. Beyond it are deeper levels of prayer characterized by internal silence and lengthy periods of time. In this state, one enters into deeper levels of consciousness. Ordinary consciousness is stilled, and one sits quietly in the presence of God. Typically called contemplation or meditation, its deepest levels are described as a communion or union with God. One enters the realm of spirit and experiences God. Now, for a number of reasons, this form of prayer is rare in the modern church. It has largely disappeared in most Christian denominations, but it's a style of prayer that Jesus used most often, as did many of the great Jewish prophets and leaders like Moses and Elijah. Fortunately, there has been a rediscovery of this deeper form of prayer. Sometimes we call it contemplative prayer, with the goal being the experience of communing with God. The psalmist says that this form of prayer is a commandment. The psalmist says, "Be still and know that I am God." The challenge is for us to make space in our day to find a place of solitude. That place does not have to be a remote location. It can be your kitchen while everyone is asleep. The important thing is to separate yourself from the material, physical world, mentally and spiritually. And we are about to begin the season of Lent, a season that traditionally begins with the story of Jesus going out into the wilderness by himself for 40 days, fasting and praying. It's as if this event signaled his taking his spiritual journey and his relationship with God more seriously and taking it to another level. I can't think of a better time for us to do likewise. Last night, I went to see our 97-year-old church member, Betty Cooper, who just recently went into hospice house. And when I arrived, Betty was sound asleep. She looked so comfortable, so at peace. And the people at hospice house do an incredible job for our loved ones. We are so blessed to have this facility and these caretakers. As I sat with Betty, I thought about our moments of solitude and silence with God. It dawned on me that our times of stillness with God not only strengthen us for our days on earth, they also prepare us for our time of transition. As we get more and more comfortable with stillness and quietness, as we feel closer to the divine mystery we call God, as we are able to let go of our ego more and more, we become more comfortable with letting go and giving our love and our trust and our spirit to the divine mystery, the source of life. As Jesus did when he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And so I finished the sermon last night and got a call this morning letting me know that Betty made her transition last night. Our prayers are with her daughter Susan, who is a big part of our faith community. You see, the Christian life is about a relationship with God. The way our relationship to God is nourished is through the very simple act of paying attention to that relationship, just as we would our human relationships. A human relationship grows and deepens to the extent that we pay attention to it, that we spend time on it. What we're talking about is a transformation of the self that comes about through paying attention to our relationship with God. That can take many forms. The most common form is prayer, and real close to it is worship. But it can also take the form of dream work, journaling, remembering God in the course of the day. All of that's involved in paying attention to the relationship. It's about practicing it and practicing it. It's not about trying to be good. Let go of that. It's about seeking to become more and more centered in the reality we call God. And so early in the morning, while it was still very dark, he went out by himself to a deserted place and prayed. Amen and amen.